Welcome to Wife Cheating Story. I hope you have an enjoyable and relaxing time listening. Let's get started.
I remember the morning like it was carved into ice, so clear, so cold, so permanent. My name is Malik Okoye, and on that morning, I was 14, stubborn, and terrified. I woke to a bedroom too big for one boy, the stillness pressing down on me like a weight. Frost patterned the window panes in jagged filigrees, refusing to melt even as the sun climbed higher. The branches outside my window looked brittle, as if they might snap under winter's grip. Snow lay thick on the ground, unblemished and cold. I should have been on the bus, heading to another day of algebra and English literature, but I wasn't. Not anymore. 2 days earlier, my world had fractured when the call reached our home in Oberland. My parents, my anchor, my world, had died in a head-on collision on that frozen bend not far from our doorstep. The ice-slick road had stolen them both in an instant, leaving my little brother Kian and me alone. When the extended family filed into our lives, they brought sympathy and shared grief. Their hands felt heavy and their eyes wet, but beneath their sorrow lurked practical thoughts. A widow's pension would come, but not enough for 2 boys. They would raise the one who promised the brightest future. And so, they picked Kian. I watched it happen in whispers behind closed doors, in conversations that trailed off when I approached. "He's younger," they murmured. "He has more years to live." I knew they meant more years to work. I wasn't innocent. I'd spent my 3rd year of junior high as a good student, but not an exceptional one. My grades hovered in the average range. I had no scholarship prospects. Kian, by contrast, was brilliant, an instinctive reader of numbers and words. They chose him to mold into someone who could pull the family up from its debts. As for me, I became the expendable one. The night of the final meeting, I lay in my bed listening to muffled voices through the thin walls. I heard Andafani say, "We'll keep him in school as long as we can, but he must be the priority." And Cousin Emika's voice, crisp, certain, added, "Malik understands. He's strong." I didn't resent them. Survival demanded hard choices. I resented the circumstances that forced their hands. I lay rigid, staring at the ceiling, the word survival echoing in my chest. I knew I was on my own. The next morning, I stood before the principal of a construction crew in a dusty office, my 15-year-old face pressed into a forged ID that said I was 18. I could barely trace the letters of my own name, let alone any qualifications for a laborer's job. Yet the foreman glanced at my forged papers and shrugged, handing me a battered pair of gloves. "We need hands today. Keep up or get out." And so, I left behind chalk-dusted classrooms and desks scratched with other boys' dreams, replacing them with morning sun beating on my back, cement dust in my lungs, and the metallic click of rebar under my hands. The work was brutal. My arms ached, my nails broke, and my boots filled with gravel. But each brick I laid, each beam I hoisted, felt like an affirmation. I was building something real, something lasting. I think now that I was running towards something I didn't fully understand: honor, maybe, or pride. I carried my grief in my bones, a hollow ache that no physical labor could erase. I worked through blistered hands and searing headaches, pretending I was 18 because 16 didn't feel old enough to face the world alone. I learned to lift steel girders and pour concrete with precision, mimicking the older men who never asked me questions. They saw muscle and silence where once a boy in a school uniform had stood. They never looked back. But each evening, when I returned to our cramped room above Mama Folake's little shop, I became Malik again. I scrubbed the day's grime from my skin in a bucket filled with cold water and a bar of soap. I dried my hair roughly with a threadbare towel, then stood before the cracked mirror and tried not to flinch at the stranger staring back. I put on the same threadbare jeans and the tattered shirt I had washed and mended myself, then went to where Kian sat doing his homework by lamplight. There he was, that boy with his nose buried in his schoolbook, pen-scratching numbers and letters like they were lifelines. He looked up as I entered, his eyes bright with trust. "Big brother," he said, "could you help me with this problem?" Sometimes I hesitated. My own math skills had faded in the glare of the sun and the grit of dust. But I couldn't refuse him. "Sure," I said, sinking beside him on the wooden stool. We bent over his notebook together, and I guided him through fractions and formulas. I traced the lines of his neat handwriting, reminded by each calculation of how brilliant he was. I watched his brow crease in concentration and then smooth out in triumph when the answer clicked. When he smiled at me, it was like the sun coming through the frost on that bend in the road, a warmth I thought I'd lost forever. When learning gave out, we ate cold rice from a galvanized bowl. Kian, with his cheeks bulging like a chipmunk, told me about his dreams, scholarships abroad, becoming a doctor, helping kids who didn't have anyone. I listened, my heart both proud and breaking. "You'll do it," I told him, even though my chest felt too tight to breathe. "I'll make sure you can." Then, late at night, when Kian drifted off to sleep with his head against my shoulder, I folded space around me and let the tears come. They were quiet, silent as the frost that clung to the window. I cried for my parents, for the childhood I'd forfeited, for the boy who carried my torch. I cried until the candle guttered and died. By dawn, I wiped my face with the back of my hand and shouldered my tools. The sun would rise again, cold, unforgiving, promising another day of work. And I would be there, bent against the wind, mixing mortar and forging the future for the boy who believed I held the sky in my hands. Because in a world that valued survival over sentiment, I understood that strength was born in sacrifice. And so, with frozen breath and aching bones, I stood and faced the day the snow didn't melt. The dawn light came softer on the day I introduced myself to rice, hope, and stubbornness. I wore the same threadbare jeans and taped-up boots that bore the scuffs of yesterday's work. My back already ached before breakfast, but I squeezed into the narrow doorway of our room and found Kian, hair still mussed from sleep, hunched over his geometry book at the corner table. His slender fingers traced the straight edge of a protractor as if measuring his own ambition. I paused, breathing in the scent of coconut oil, and his hair mingled with the faint tang of yesterday's cement dust on my skin. "Morning, champ," I said, ripping open the sack of rice. He looked up, eyes bright, and smiled. "Morning, big bro." Those two words felt like a sunrise. I ladled steaming rice into 2 bowls and poured the watery stew Mama Folake traded for in small, irregular payments. Kian ate slowly, savoring each spoonful. I sipped my malt drink, its sweetness a luxury I allowed on Sundays only. He pointed at a problem in his notebook, fractions layered over one another, denominators that frightened me. "Stay with me," he said. I put down the bowl and sat beside him, rubbing my knuckles together. My own schooling had been truncated by tragedy and necessity, but I still remembered the logic of numbers, how they bent to reason when hearts might break. We leaned toward the lamplight, me tracing the lines and walking him through step after step: convert, simplify, cross-multiply. With each explanation, I felt the warmth of connection, the unbroken lineage of brotherhood. But time had a way of insisting on its own demands. By 8 o'clock, I was ducking under scaffolding, trading mortar in a wheelbarrow that groaned under its weight. The foreman barked orders in the peculiar, clipped accent of a man reared on discipline rather than dreams, and I answered with silent nods. My shirt soaked with sweat within minutes, the sun glaring off the half-finished wall in front of me. We were building a bungalow for a banker's family, one of those grand designs with polished marble steps that would never see the rough edges of real life. It felt ironic that I, displaced from my own childhood home, was helping to construct a place I'd never belonged. But a job was a lifeline, and so I tamped the cement, leveled each brick, and measured spacing with a practiced eye. When lunchtime came, I shrugged out of my gloves and sat on the dusty ground, pulling out the tiffin box Kian's scholarship aunt had sent, rice and beans neatly layered, stewed plantain on the side. I savored the beans first, chewing steadily as my mind drifted to his fledgling dreams. I imagined him in a lecture hall, scribbling notes on a crisp pad, his brown eyes alight with wonder. Those dreams were paper fragility perched atop my broad shoulders, but I bore them gladly. I closed my eyes and hummed a lullaby our mother used to sing. In my mind, I was a boy cradling another boy, and the weight of the world seemed, if only for a moment, to recede. Afternoons were a flurry of labor. Hot sun turned the metal scaffolding into a furnace. Sweat pulled at my collar, stung my eyes, and seeped through my shirt to my skin. My forearms trembled from the repeated lift of blocks weighing more than my own lean frame. Yet every so often, I glanced at the horizon, where the glittering spires of high-rise apartments loomed as if mocking our struggle. Those apartments were for people who could afford to ignore the bones it took to build them. I worked under the assumption that my sacrifice was invisible, and maybe it was. But I knew that each drop of sweat would fertilize the soil of my brother's future. As the sun dipped toward the crimson horizon, I scraped the last of the mortar from my tools and trudged home. The path wound past stalls where merchants packed up produce, the air fragrant with the tang of peppers and the sweetness of overripe mangoes. Children with tuition wages in hand ran toward their classrooms. I paused at the school gates, watching them disappear inside the walls I had forfeited. I thought of the classroom's chalk-dusted desks and faint echo of recitation, of gum-stained floors where I once daydreamed about a life less tethered to manual labor. Memories pricked at me, but I pushed them aside. There was homework to be done, and my little brother waited. At home, our single-room dwelling was dim in the evening light. I lit the kerosene lamp and placed Kian's uniform over the back of the wooden chair. He sat at the table, pencil in hand, books open like portals to a world untarnished by hardship. I joined him, dropping my boots by the door so they wouldn't track grit onto the floor. He handed me his algebra book. I tried this one on my own, but I got stuck. He slid the notebook closer, revealing equations tangled like vines. I leaned in, smoothing my hand over the page. The numbers looked friendly, waiting for their patterns to be unlocked. I traced the steps with my finger, factor here, combine like terms there, isolate the variable. He nodded and wrote furiously. Thanks, he said, eyes shining. I ruffled his hair. You've got it. His joy was a beam of light that chased away the shadows on our thin walls. Later, after the books were closed and homework completed, I washed our bowls in a bucket of cold water. The routine was simple. Pour, scrub, rinse, repeat. The metal spoon clanged against the enamel bowl, a staccato rhythm in the quiet. Kian hummed softly, a tune I recognized from our childhood mornings. When the work was done, we sat on the narrow bed, sharing the single mattress covered by 2 blankets. He lay curled at one end. I stretched my long legs toward the foot. Above us, a lone bulb cast a warm glow, the only star in our tiny universe. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the cracks that spidered across its surface, imagining they were roads leading somewhere. Somewhere he could journey without me. Big bro, he said in the hush, one day I'll build a house where you don't have to work so hard. Where you can finish school, and we can both have the future you dreamed of. His words were a promise and a burden wrapped in innocence. I swallowed past the lump in my throat. That day will come, I whispered. A tear escaped and ran down my cheek, but I blinked it away before he noticed. He closed his eyes and drifted off, trusting in me the way only a brother could. I sat there in the dark, listening to his steady breathing, thinking about the journey ahead. Brick by brick, equation by equation, I was building his future. And in doing so, I discovered that homework wasn't just fractions and algebra. It was the countless lessons in perseverance, love, and sacrifice that no textbook could teach. I folded my arms behind my head and stared at the bare wall. The day's exhaustion weighed on my limbs, but my heart felt strangely light. For in raising Kian, I had found my purpose. And no avalanche of hardship, no unmelting snow, could freeze the warmth that his dreams ignited in my soul. The first time I met Marin, she arrived like she'd stepped out of a magazine spread, high heels clicking over the warped floorboards of our living room, a tailored blazer hugging her slender frame, and hair so perfectly coiled it might have come with its own instruction manual. Kian stood beside her, cheeks flushed, eyes bright with something I hadn't seen since our parents died, the slow thrill of hope. He opened the door, smoothing the collar of his shirt, and I felt a quiet pinch of pride. He'd always been the boy who carried his dreams in his chest like a song, but today he carried her. I'd prepared jollof rice, simmering fragrant red stew until it clung to each grain, the spicy aroma dancing through the cramped room. I'd scavenged tomatoes from the market, bought fresh peppers with the last of my pay, and stirred the pot until the oil gleamed on the surface, like a promise of better days. I'd set 2 mismatched plates on the table and disposed our lone chair beside Kian's. My boots still bore caked mud from the construction site, and I gave them a quick wipe on the tread-worn mat before stepping inside. Kian's apartment smelled like spices and sweat and something new possibility. Marin slipped off her heels, landing on her toes before folding them neatly at the door. She smiled at me, a polished tilt of her lips that revealed straight, white teeth. Thank you for having me, she said, her voice calm and poised. She held herself like a sculpture displayed under perfect lighting, smooth lines and unruffled edges. I forced my shoulders to relax. It's my pleasure, I said, trying to keep my tone even. I ladled rice onto her plate first, then Kian's, because I couldn't bear to see him wait. She nodded in appreciation and murmured, "It smells wonderful." Her words felt warm, but something flickered behind the safety of her eyes. As she ate, I watched her napkin approach her lips with a deliberate grace I recognized from corporate boardrooms. The same measured gestures executives practiced when they didn't want to appear messy or too familiar. She took bites, chewed carefully, and set her fork down before wiping her mouth. She didn't eat out of hunger. She ate to show she could, to demonstrate she belonged. Across the table, Kian inhaled greedily, as if every grain might slip away if he didn't claim it quickly. I envied his ease, his entitlement to this simple pleasure. Between mouthfuls, she angled her head toward me. "Big bro Malik," she said, her voice warm enough. The words tasted strange coming from her mouth, as if she'd borrowed them for courtesy's sake. I lowered my gaze to the table, pressing my fork into a lump of rice. "Just Malik is fine," I murmured. She offered a small, apologetic smile and set her fork down again. "Of course," she said, and I knew she didn't mean it. After dinner, she lingered at the table, scanning the walls where faded photographs of our parents hung in chipped frames. An old picture of Mom, radiant in her graduation robe, and Dad in his crisp white coat beamed from the wall. She glanced at them, lips parting just a fraction, but her eyes didn't soften. Instead, they registered the poverty of our surroundings: thin plywood walls, a single bulb dangling from the ceiling, and paint peeling in strips. I felt my chest tighten, as though her gaze was a probe searching for weaknesses. I could almost hear her thoughts. "Look at these hardships, observe them, but don't touch them." She treated our lives as artifacts in a museum, interesting but distant. Kian reached across the table and took her hand, his fingers brushing mine for a moment. She welcomed his warmth but recoiled from mine. I tried not to let it sting. He smiled at me, as if to reassure me that this was good, that I should like her because he did. And because I loved him, I let that smile settle in my chest, muting the anger and hurt that bubbled beneath the surface. When she left, she thanked me again. "Thank you for dinner, Malik. It was delicious." She paused, as if weighing her next words. "You're very kind to him." She said it politely, but the emphasis lurked onto him, as if I were an accessory to Kian's life, not part of it. I nodded, forcing a smile that felt brittle. "He deserved it," I said softly. She tilted her head, curiosity flickering across her face, then tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and stepped into the night. The door clicked shut, and I stood in the hush she left behind, listening to the sound of Kian's footsteps as he followed her to the gate. Later, I heard Kian on the phone in the courtyard, describing the meal, praising me for the rice, and marveling at the way she asked for seconds. I leaned against the wall, closing my eyes against the sting of tears I refused to shed. He was in love, and her polished smile was his sun. I didn't want to be the rain, so I willed my pain into silence. Over the next few weeks, Marin made more appearances, Sundays at lunch, evenings when Kian needed study breaks. Each time, I prepared something: spicy pepper soup, fried plantain and stew, steamed mois wrapped in banana leaves. She complimented my cooking in carefully measured phrases and asked questions about my work on the construction site as if inspecting a proposal. "What's your current project?" she inquired one day, folding her hands in her lap. "Is it residential or commercial?" I described the bungalow I helped build last month, recounting measurements and materials. She nodded, polite. "It must be rewarding to shape the skyline," she said. I felt something twist when she said skyline, like our hard-won bungalow meant nothing in her urban lexicon. One afternoon, she accepted my invitation to help with Kian's homework. He was wrestling with calculus, and I asked her to explain the derivatives she'd learned in college. She took the pen and sketched equations with confidence, coaching Kian through the steps. I watched them work together, his grin wide when he solved a problem and her hair falling forward in a sleek curtain. Their synergy was electric. I wanted to tell her that when he looked at her, it was as if the sun had risen just for him, that he needed that light in a life so often dark. But I said nothing. Behind her back, I cooked another pot of stew and sat with my own thoughts. I wondered whether she would ever see the scars on my hands as badges of sacrifice rather than marks of poverty. I wondered if she'd visit my sparsely furnished room and notice the stack of textbooks I'd abandoned, the stride-me-up medal I'd once won in primary school, and the snapped locket of our mother's picture hanging from my mirror. I wondered if she'd see me, really see me, rather than the silhouette I cut against her boardroom backdrop. One evening, I caught her alone in the courtyard, pacing beside the flickering lamplight. She looked up as I approached, startled. "Big bro Malik." "Sorry, Malik," she stammered. I pressed a hand to my chest. "It's fine," I said. She swallowed and looked away. "I wanted to thank you," she said gently, "for everything you do for Kian. I know he means the world to you." My throat tightened. "He's my brother," I said, simpler than I'd planned. She nodded, eyes glistening. "He told me how hard you worked to give him a chance." She hesitated, and in that pause, I saw a flicker of something, Remorse? Curiosity? Connection? Then she turned and slipped away, leaving me alone with the night wind and the ache of unspoken words. I exhaled, pressing my palm against the damp brick wall. Her admission lingered like a promise. Perhaps she did see me, occasionally, in glimpses I could almost believe. But if she did, she chose to shield herself with that polished smile, walking through our lives as an observer rather than a participant. Kian deserved someone who would share our burdens, embrace our scars, and stand beside us in the dust and the dawn. I wanted her to love him without asking him to leave me behind. That night, as I lay on the narrow bed, I resolved to keep cooking for them, to keep opening the door, to keep pretending her refinement was a gift rather than an insult, because I loved Kian too much to let him go. And a brother's love, I had learned, was both shield and sword, protective and unforgiving. In the hush of the room, I whispered into the darkness, "She's your choice, Kian. But know this, I gave you everything I had. And I'll stand here, kitchen palms and all, until you come home." And with that vow, I drifted into sleep, dreaming of a time when her polished smile might crack and the warmth beneath would finally shine through. A week before their wedding, I got the call in the afternoon, just as the sun was dipping low enough to turn the sky to copper. I was on the scaffolding, my gloves stained with cement, muscles humming from the day's labor. My phone buzzed in my pocket, an unknown number. I wiped my hands on my dusty jeans and climbed down the ladder, each rung jarring my arms until I reached the ground. I answered with a cautious hello, and heard Marin's voice on the other end. Clipped, precise, devoid of greeting. "Malik, I wanted to talk to you privately. About the wedding." My heart thudded, caught in my throat. I glanced over at the half-finished bungalow, marble steps already polished, granite slabs waiting for installation, and felt a pang of contradiction. I had built that home with my bare hands, and now someone I barely knew was telling me it wasn't my place to walk through its doors. "We're meeting at the hall this evening," she continued. "Alone." She gave no explanation, just instructions. I swallowed, mind spinning. "All right," I said, forcing calm into my voice. "What time?" "7," she said, then hung up. No goodbye. Nothing. Just a cold click that echoed in my ear. I stood there for a long moment, staring at my phone. 7 o'clock, she'd said. I wiped sweat from my brow, wrestled down the rising anger, and climbed back up the ladder as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed in that instant. All day I worked with a hollow ache in my chest. The foreman barked orders, but I barely registered them. My arms lifted rebar, leveled planks, and mixed mortar, but my mind replayed her tone about the wedding. I thought of Kian, pacing our living room earlier that morning while reciting to himself the order of service, the processional, the readings, the vow exchange. His anticipation was raw and bright. He believed this day would shine for him, a new beginning, and I had wanted to be part of it. But Marin's call had cast a shadow. As evening fell, I washed the grime from my hands with a bucket of water in the courtyard, then changed out of my work clothes into my only clean shirt, a pale blue Oxford, and the suit Kian had bought me for interviews he expected I would take one day. The suit still smelled faintly of mothballs and hope. I adjusted the collar, tugged the sleeves, and checked my reflection in the warped mirror nailed to the wall. I looked like a stranger stepping into a memory not his own. The banquet hall sat tucked behind high hedges, its facade gleaming ivory against the dusk. Streamers of fairy lights flitted in the gentle breeze, and garlands of white roses trailed above the entrance. I approached through the side door, heart pounding so loud I feared the ushers would hear it. Inside, the hall was hushed and half-lit, chairs arranged in neat rows, the aisle wide and empty. I paused at the threshold, scanning the benches. No one sat. No one stirred. I approached a young usher by the entrance, her cheeks flushed with worry. "Sir," she whispered, leaning close. "No one from the groom's side has shown up." She sounded relieved to be telling someone, but panicked beneath the calm. "We were told to expect family." I nodded, suddenly dizzy. "Family?" I echoed. She shook her head. "They said they'd come," but her voice trailed off. I swallowed. "Thank you," I murmured, turning on trembling legs. I sprinted down the marble corridor to the suite reserved for the wedding party. My boots clicked against the floor until I burst through the door. Kian stood in the center of the room, adjusting his cufflinks, face pale in the lamp's glow. He looked at me, confusion and relief mingling in his eyes. "Malik," he said, relief in his voice. "You came." I closed the door behind me and swallowed hard. I couldn't stay home. My voice cracked. raw with something between shame and defiance. He set his shoulders, squared his back, and met my gaze. The panic drained from his face, replaced by a calm fierceness I'd only seen when he faced an impossible exam and refused to fail. "Good," he said quietly, "because this wedding doesn't need to happen." Confusion knotted my stomach. "What do you mean?" I asked. His lips pressed into a firm line. "Marin and I, this is over." My breath caught. "You what? You canceled it." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "Yes. I told her we're not doing it." I stared, heart pounding, disbelief ripping through me. "But why?" He stepped closer, voice steady. "Because I'm not marrying someone who treats my brother like an embarrassment." He gestured toward me. "When she called you a construction worker who would make her parents uncomfortable, she insulted you. And when she insulted you, she insulted me." His words were steady, unwavering. I felt tears sting at my eyes, tears of pride and pain twined together. "She said what?" I rasped. Kian squared his shoulders. "She told me flat out she didn't want you at our wedding." His fists clenched at his sides. "That I needed to hide my past to satisfy her parents' expectations." He laughed, a short, hollow sound. "As if the person I am could be hidden." He took a breath. "I won't walk down that aisle. Not without you." The doors swung open behind Marin. She stood framed in the hallway, lace gown in stark contrast to the dim corridor, fury blazing in her eyes. "Why haven't we started?" she demanded, voice brittle with anger. Kian turned toward her with calm resolve. "Because we're not doing it." Her eyes narrowed. "Excuse me," she said, voice rising. He stepped forward, placing himself between her and me. "I'm not marrying someone who disrespects my family." She huffed, raising her hands in exasperation. "You're seriously canceling our wedding because of a builder?" Her tone was contemptuous, as if I were a stain she could wash off with disdain. I felt Kian wince, but he held his ground. "He's my brother. He raised me. He gave up his schooling so I could chase these dreams. If you can't accept him, then you can't accept me." Silence fell like a curtain. Outside, guests hovered in doorways, confusion rippling through them. Wedding planners peeked in, phones pressed to their ears. The head usher lowered her eyes, ashamed. Marin's cheeks burned with humiliation, her lips trembling. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it, lips pinched in anger. Her father burst into the room. A silver-haired man in a tailored suit, face red with outrage. "What is the meaning of this?" he thundered. Marin threw up her hands. "He chose his dropout brother over me," she cried. Her voice cracked, and I saw disbelief flicker in her eyes. "What?" her father demanded. "You chose this." He gaped at me, a stranger in his daughter's arms. "I thought you wanted the best for my daughter." I stepped forward, heart pounding with unbidden courage. "She insulted me," I said, voice low but clear. "She told my brother I wasn't good enough to stand by his side. She told him I'd embarrass her family." The room fell silent. Even Marin's mother covered her face in shame. Her father's face twisted between anger and realization. He looked at his daughter, then at Kian, and finally at me. "Is this true?" he asked her. She looked down, unable to meet his gaze. I thought," she began, but the words faltered. He turned to Kian. "My son," he said, voice softer. "Is this the man you want standing by you?" Kian stepped back, hand on my shoulder. "He's the man who raised me," he said. "He's my family." At that moment, a single truth shone brighter than any floral arch or polished tile. Blood ran deeper than lace and satin, and loyalty outweighed pretense. There would be no wedding here, no staged photographs, no ivory cake. Instead, in that hushed, fluorescent-lit suite, a family stood united in quiet defiance. And as I met Kian's eyes, steady, unwavering, I knew that in abandoning the lie, we had reclaimed something far more precious, our dignity and each other. I sat for hours after the call, the phone slipping from my fingers and clattering against the wooden floor. Its shrill ring had cut through my day like a blade, and when Marin's clipped request echoed in the empty room, asking me to skip Kian's wedding, it felt as though she had pried the air from my lungs. I stared at the call log until the numbers blurred, convinced that if I studied them long enough, they would rearrange into some Kinder message. But there was no mercy in those digits. When I finally moved, it was to the small window overlooking the dusty street where I had once pictured brighter futures for both of us. Outside, vendors packed away produce, motorbikes roared past, and the sun dipped toward its nightly surrender. Everything went on as if my world hadn't cracked in two. I told myself it was for Kian's happiness, that this day was about him, not me. I reminded myself of the warmth in his eyes when he described the aisle lined with white roses, the ivory drapes billowing like soft clouds above his head. He believed in fairy tales, in love triumphant over hardship, and I loved him too much to stand between him and his dreams. So I said nothing at home, not when he hovered by the mirror rehearsing his vows, not when he asked if I'd considered a new suit, and not when he smiled at me with that soft glow of brotherly devotion. I nodded, offered encouraging words, and watched him prepare while I hollowed out my own hopes to make room for his. The day before the wedding, Kian bounded through the door with a stack of seating charts and schedules. He flapped them in my direction like a conductor's baton, excitement dancing in his steps. "Big bro," he said, "they've decided on gold flatware and peach napkins. What do you think?" His grin was irresistible, earnest as a child's. I forced a smile and suggested peach napkins complemented the ivory drapery. He beamed, hugging me as if I were the architect of all decisions, not the man they told to stay away. For a moment, I felt that old warm tide of pride, but beneath it churned a current of shame. I reminded myself that after tomorrow, I would be noted only by my absence, a ghost at the celebration. Night fell and I lay on the narrow bed, staring at the cracked ceiling. I thought of the parents who raised us together, their laughter filling this very room on better days. I imagined them greeting guests, beaming at the union of two souls. I pictured them beside me in the front row, proud and uninterrupted by judgment. But tomorrow, they would not be there. And I would not be there. A tremor of anger shook me, anger at Marin's standards, at her parents' expectations, at the cruel logic that deemed my sacrifice insufficient. I felt the bitterness sharpen in my chest, a bitter fruit ripening in silence. When dawn broke, I wore my only clean white shirt under the suit Kian had purchased for me. I stood before the cracked mirror and straightened my collar, running a hand through my hair. I looked the part of the supportive brother, the proud relative. But inside, I was unstitched. I paced the single room, touching the worn edges of the mattress where Kian slept, imagining him waking up to find me gone. I pictured him searching the hall for my familiar face among the congregation, then realizing I was absent, handpicked to disappear for the sake of someone else's comfort. My heart hurt for him, for me, for both of us. I swallowed down my resentment and trudged toward the banquet hall, heart pounding in my ears. Each step on the cracked pavement felt like trudging through wet cement. I rehearsed my part, wish him well, offer congratulations, make a toast, then slip away quietly before the vows. But I knew plans made in the quiet corners of a broken heart rarely survive the brightness of day. I arrived at the hall's doors with trembling hands and paused, inhaling the scent of fresh blooms. Guests in colorful attire streamed past me, faces bright with anticipation. The hall's doors opened before any usher could guide me, and I entered, suit crisp, resolve brittle. Inside, I found a chandelier of twinkling lights, a mirrored dance floor, and rows of chairs draped in ivory satin. Flowers spilled from every corner, white lilies and peach roses arranged in graceful bouquets. Waiters in black vests glided between guests carrying trays of champagne. I felt as though I'd stepped into someone else's dream. A tapping at my shoulder startled me, and I turned to see a coordinator holding a clipboard. "Mr. Okoye?" she asked, voice polite. I nodded. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "I have you down as declined," she said. "I wasn't to expect you." I lifted my chin. "Plans can change," I said, voice steady. Her brow rose, then she turned to summon a colleague. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. I wandered to the back row, scanning for Kian. Whispers followed me. He showed up. After all that? But I ignored them. I found the last seat, slid into it, and sat. The seat felt too big for one man, too empty beside me. I folded my hands and waited. Time slowed as the room hushed. A heavy curtain at the far end parted, and the organist began playing. The procession started, bridesmaids in peach, ring bearers in black suits. The groom would walk in next. My heart hammered as guests rose. I looked to the aisle, expecting Kian to appear, to see his face soften when he saw me standing there. But the aisle stayed empty. Silence settled. Confusion rippled through the crowd. I stood, heart in my throat, and strode to the stage. Footsteps echoed against marble tiles. Guests craned their necks. I reached the foot of the aisle and called out, voice echoing. "Kian." My pulse rattled in my ears as I searched for him. The organist stopped mid-note, and silence fell like an ocean. Some of the older relatives gasped. The coordinators looked at each other. And then, at the far end, Kian emerged. He wore his suit like armor, face grim with determination. He walked toward me, each step resounding. The bridesmaids gasped. The bride's mother covered her mouth. I held my ground. When Kian reached me, he slid his hand into mine. I felt the tremor in his fingers, a reflection of my own. He leaned close and whispered, "Thank you." No further explanation, just gratitude. And then he turned back to the silent hall and raised both hands in a calm gesture. "This wedding is canceled." A collective gasp rose, then hush reclaimed the room. He addressed the crowd. "I will not marry someone who told my brother to stay away. To honor me is to honor him. This wedding cannot proceed." His voice was clear, unwavering. The guests exchanged bewildered glances, cameras flashed. And in that moment, I understood that by showing up, I had given him the courage to stand his ground. As we walked away from the aisle, hand in hand, the murmurs followed us. They really did it. What a statement. He's noble. But I didn't hear them. My focus was on Kian, his shoulders squared, his gaze straight ahead. His strength buoyed me, and in turn, I felt my own spirit mend. We exited into the cool evening air, leaving the ivory hall and its silent chairs behind. Outside, the night sky stretched in velvet, punctuated by distant city lights. I pressed my forehead against his shoulder. He wrapped his arm around me, and together we walked into the night, free from pretense, bound by blood and defiance. Our future was unwritten, but in that quiet aftermath, we had reclaimed our story, and no invitation, no matter how polished, could deny us that. I had barely closed the door behind me when I heard Kian's voice, steady, urgent, calling my name from the courtyard. I paused under the single, flickering light bulb, its yellow glow casting uneven shadows against the peeling paint of our walls. I looked up at the bulb as if it held all the answers, the tiny filament flickering like a heartbeat, and for a moment I wondered if the night would swallow me whole. Then I heard him again. "Malik, you good?" His footsteps crunched on the gravel, and I turned to face him, arms folded across my chest, the weight of Marin's words still lodged in my throat. When I met his eyes, he saw something there I couldn't conceal. Hurt and humiliation mingled with the stubborn pride that had carried me this far. We stood in silence beneath the bulb. He let me have that moment, as he always did, and I drew in a shuddering breath. "Your fiancée asked me not to come," I said, voice low and rough like gravel. "She said I'd be an embarrassment." The word hung between us, tainted with condescension. He didn't wince. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, tall and unflinching, letting my confession settle into the cool night air. I thought he might argue her case or ask me to soften the blow, but instead he took a step closer, his shoulders squared as if bracing for his own storm. "Kian," I began, throat tight, "I did it for you." My words rushed out, raw and urgent. "I stayed home so you'd have the perfect day you dreamed of. I wanted—" My voice broke, and I swallowed hard, tasting grief on my tongue. I'd rehearsed my explanation over and over, but it sounded hollow in the hush of the courtyard. He raised a hand and placed it on my shoulder, firm and steady, and I inhaled the familiar scent of his cologne, fresh mint and something citrusy, and suddenly I was 7 again, running through the compound with him on my heels, chasing sunlight until dusk. He squeezed my shoulder and spoke with quiet authority. "Malik, stay home on the wedding day. Just trust me." His command was simple, devoid of anger or reproach, just a firm appeal to the bond between us. I blinked, uncertain, caught between relief that he still wanted me in his life and the sharp sting that I'd been asked to vanish. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already knew he had plans I couldn't fathom. He took a breath, letting the words find him. "I want you to stay home," he said, tone even. "Don't come to the hall. Wait for me there." My stomach twisted. "But Kian," I started, but he put a finger to his lips, silencing me with the same calm he displayed before an exam that intimidated every other student. "Trust me," he repeated. "Please." His eyes were bright with something I'd rarely seen, hope edged with defiance. He wasn't begging, he was choosing, and in that choice, he included me and excluded her. I wanted to argue, to demand an explanation, to tell him I couldn't sit out the one moment our family would remember, but his gaze held me in place. I nodded, stiffly, and he gave a faint smile, a smile that carried both gratitude and sorrow. He turned and walked away, footsteps echoing on the stone path, leaving me alone beneath the wavering bulb. I watched him go until his figure dissolved into the darkness. The bulb flickered once, twice, then stilled in its faint glow, as if holding its breath along with me. I stayed there long after he disappeared, tracing the cracks in the concrete with my gaze, remembering each moment that had led us here. I thought of the prayers I had whispered to our parents' portraits, begging for strength to raise him, to guide him, to make him see that the world could be forged with sweat and love. And I thought that maybe, in asking me to stay home, he was forging his own path of strength, refusing to let someone else dictate the terms of his loyalty. When I finally turned away from the courtyard and climbed the narrow stairs to our room, my legs trembled beneath me. In the corner, the stack of homework lay untouched. On the small table, the half-empty bowl of soup I had prepared for him waited in the cold. I moved to it, lifted the bowl, and settled onto the edge of our bed. I spooned the lukewarm broth into my mouth, tasting the faint heat of pepper and the sadness that seasons each swallow. I sat there long into the night, the bowl empty, the lamplight flickering, until my eyelids grew heavy. I curled into the thin mattress, hugging the remains of my resolve, and thought of how loyalty sometimes meant sacrifice so profound it felt like erasure. I wondered whether I would wake the next morning with the courage to stay away, or with a heart so heavy I would choose to walk into battle alongside him. I prayed for clarity, for strength, for the bond that bound us to illuminate what lay ahead. And when sleep finally claimed me, it came with dreams of white-draped halls and ivory chairs, of my parents watching from the front row with proud smiles. But in those dreams, my place wasn't empty. I stood beside Kian, our shoulders almost touching, and the light from their portraits shone down on us like a blessing. In that fleeting vision, I realized that no invitation, no demand for my absence, could sever the truth of where I belonged, at his side, in light or shadow, under any bulb or chandelier, as his brother and as his keeper. I couldn't stay home. The thought churned in my gut as I buttoned the suit Kian had bought me, the fabric stiff and foreign against my skin. I tried to obey his request, tried to vanish into the background so his wedding might sparkle in pristine perfection. But as I touched the gold cufflinks and straightened the collar, the emptiness of absence felt worse than any confrontation. I needed to stand beside him, even if it meant shattering someone else's illusions. I climbed into the tricycle that would bring me to the hall, clutching my bag of belongings as if it contained a shield. The sun was past its peak, slanting through narrow alleys and bouncing off corrugated tin roofs. Vendors were closing their stalls, bargaining over the remains of fruits and vegetables. I watched their weary faces, and somewhere in their fatigue I found kinship, people who worked until the world refused to pay attention. I paid the fare and stepped onto the pavement outside the venue, the click of my polished shoes startling in the hush that fell over the driveway. The wedding hall rose before me in regal splendor, ivory pillars swirled with golden filigree, a grand arch of fresh roses framing the entrance. It was like a palace built for joy, yet the air felt heavy, as though sorrow had lingered among the petals. I inhaled, tasting the faint sweetness of jasmine and the tang of anticipation. An usher in crisp black trousers and a white shirt glanced my way. "Sir?" she asked, eyebrows knitting in confusion. I'm here for the groom's family," I said, voice steady though my heart raced. She checked her list, lips parting in surprise. "You weren't expected," she murmured, but she stepped aside. I passed through the doors, each footstep a proclamation. I belong here. Inside, the hall was silent save for the distant hum of a string quartet tuning up somewhere behind the heavy velvet drapes. Rows of chairs, 8 per side, stretched toward the altar, their satin bows already fastened, the aisle runner flanked by rose petals. No guests sat. No parents smiled. The opulence echoed off the marble floor, but the space felt hollow, like a grand tomb awaiting mourners. I walked slowly between the seats, fingertips grazing the satin as if seeking warmth. My own reflection caught in the polished surface of a window. There I stood, a solitary figure in midnight blue, framed by blossom and expectation. I paused at the head usher's station, where a clipboard lay abandoned. Behind her, the grand doors to the foyer were closed, as if locking away the ceremony that would never be. I straightened my shoulders and approached her. "Where is everyone?" I asked softly. She looked up, eyes wide. "No one has arrived from the groom's side, and the bride's parents have already gone home," she whispered, her voice trembling. My chest tightened, a cold wave washing through me. This was the moment Kian had engineered, the undoing of a celebration built on compromise. I felt pride and sorrow swirl together. He had reclaimed his day, but at the cost of tradition and pain. I turned toward the suite, thinking to find him there, to see what plan he had set in motion. The corridor stretched empty, lit by sconces that cast long shadows on the floor. I followed the polished handrails to the door marked Bridal Party, but it stood ajar. I pressed my ear to the gap and heard muffled voices, someone sobbing softly, a man's quiet laughter of disbelief. I pushed the door open and found Kian standing beside a small group of his friends. His best man, our cousin Afani, and two uncles, faces somber but proud. Marin's bouquet lay on a table, petals scattered like confessions. He looked up at me, relief and defiance shining in his gaze. I crossed the room and stood beside him. Our shoulders almost touched. He offered me a small, wry smile. "You came," he said, voice low. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I couldn't stay away. He ran a hand through his hair, tousled, as if he'd just unraveled a lifetime of expectations. "Good," he said. "Now we fix this." I studied his face, wondering how he had dared to face down his fiancée, his in-laws, and the silent judgment of high society. But his courage was mirrored in his eyes, steadfast and unwavering. I felt a surge of protector's pride. He gestured toward the main hall. "Let's show them who we are." I followed him through the corridor, each step echoing like a drumbeat of rebellion. The doors swung open to reveal the empty rows once more. Guests peeked through the side windows, curious whispers drifting in. Kian raised both arms and called out in a clear voice, "The wedding is off." Silence rippled through the hall, then erupted into murmurs and gasps. The quartet stopped playing. The air quivered. I stood beside him, hand on his back, ready to shield him from the storm. A woman's shriek cut through the murmur, one of Marin's bridesmaids, tears in her eyes. Others turned, faces etched with confusion. Some fanned themselves with programs. A few murmurers checked their phones. In the center of it all, Kian's father, our uncle, Kajenga, strode forward, shoulders squared. He lifted his chin and surveyed the assembly. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and resonant. "My son stands for his principles. Let those who came expecting spectacle go in peace. There will be no ceremony today." His statement grounded us, a declaration of loyalty and pride. I watched as people drifted away, bridesmaids clutched their skirts, photographers shook their heads, and the coordinators exchanged panicked glances. The scent of roses clung to the air, an ironic perfume for defeat. But in that moment, I saw something more powerful, a family unbowed by privilege, standing together in the ruins of pretense. I felt the weight of every brick I'd laid at the bungalow, every night spent ironing uniforms, and every silent prayer for Kian's future. All of it had led to this. Kian squeezed my shoulder. I turned to him, and for the first time that day, his relief gave way to exhilaration. "We did it," he said softly. His friends nodded, faces bright with solidarity. I wanted to laugh, cry, and roar all at once. The bouquet lay abandoned on the dais, petals drifting across the runner. I stepped forward and picked it up, inhaling the faint sweetness. Marin's wedding flowers, symbols of her rejection, became emblems of our victory. I tucked them under my arm, deciding to press them into the scrapbook of our story. The sun dipped lower, golden light filtering through the high windows and bathing the hall in a warm glow. Dust motes floated like tiny lanterns in the beam. I imagined our parents looking down, proud smiles on their faces, their hands entwined as they watched their son stand tall. I heard their laughter echo in the rafters, a sound sweeter than any wedding march. I raised my head and breathed deeply, letting the moment etch itself into my bones. Outside, the street thrummed with life, motorbikes, vendors, the pulse of the city resuming its rhythm. I carried the bouquet through the side door and handed it to Kian's mother, now smiling through tears. She pressed it to her heart and pulled me into an embrace that shook me from bruised heart to bone. "Thank you, son," she whispered. "Thank you for being his brother." I held her tight, the fabric of her dress soft against my cheek. We walked into the evening together, family reunited, vows unspoken, futures reclaimed. The hall behind us glowed like a beacon of something that might have been, but our path lay before us, uncharted and wide. Kian and I shared a glance, knowing that the road ahead would hold its own trials. But whatever came next, we would face it side by side. Two brothers bound by blood, by sacrifice, by a love that no invitation could ever deny. Marin burst into the suite like a storm unloosed, her lace train whispering against the floor. She paused at the threshold, eyes blazing. "Why haven't we started?" she demanded, voice sharp as a whip crack. The air tasted of tension and stubborn pride. Kian rose from the chair where he'd been quietly sipping water, his face calm but set with iron resolve. He met her glare without flinching. "Because we're not doing it," he said, voice steady. She scoffed, brushing stray curls from her face. "Excuse me." Her tone dripped incredulity. "We're getting married in an hour. You're seriously canceling the wedding because of a builder?" He folded his arms, unshaken. That builder fed me when I had nothing. Taught me how to read, how to stand tall, how to dream. He raised me. His gaze flicked to me, standing at the back of the room, my heart pounding but my posture unwavering. If you insult him, you insult me. Marin's lips trembled between rage and disbelief. I never insulted him. I simply asked that he not attend. Stand on display like the rest of us. She gestured around the ornate suite. This day was supposed to be about elegance, perfection. He stepped forward, the fine linen of his suit creasing. Elegance at the cost of family isn't elegance, it's pretense. I refuse to begin my marriage on a foundation of lies and shame. His voice grew firmer. You told me he would embarrass your parents, that he didn't fit your standard. You chose status over loyalty. She stared at him, mouth opening, closing. The clock's hand swept forward, reminding us that time waited for no one. The bridesmaids pressed in behind her, their bouquets drooping, their faces pale. Status, she spat. Is that what you call it? I just wanted a ceremony that reflects who I am. Her eyes darted to me, narrowing. And who you are. I stepped forward, emboldened by Kian's courage. You're marrying not just him, but everything he stands for, his past, his scars, his sacrifices. You don't get to cherry pick which pieces you accept. My voice echoed in the hushed room. If you can't respect me, you can't respect him. Silence followed, weighty as granite. Marin's cheeks flushed. Her lip trembled, her bravado draining. She looked to her attendants, but their mouths were tight lines of uncertainty. At last, she turned on her heel and fled, lace sweeping behind her. The bridesmaids fanned out, uncertain whether to follow or stay. Kian exhaled, shoulders dropping for the first time that day. He approached me, brushing a crumb of negativity from my lapel. Thank you, he murmured. I managed a nod, swallowing the lump in my throat. Together, we stood in the quiet aftermath, no vows, no rings, no witnesses. Just two brothers bound by blood and unbowed by expectation. Outside, the city's hum drifted in through the open door, a reminder that life went on beyond the gilded cage of wedding plans. And as we left that suite side by side, the weight of history felt lighter, carried by the unbreakable bond we had refused to surrender. The doors flew open before I could knock, and Marin's father charged in like a tempest unleashed, his face storm-dark and his voice cracking the silence. What's going on here? He thundered, eyes flashing between his daughter and my brother. My heart thundered back, pulse drumming in my ears. Marin, all lace and fury, pointed at me with trembling finger. He chose his dropout brother over me. She spat, voice rising like a whip. The words landed like stones. Her father's face flushed crimson, veins throbbing at his temples. You what? He bellowed, voice echoing through the empty hall. Her mother, a diminutive woman in pearls, clasped her hands to her mouth and sank into a silverback chair. We told you that reckless mouth would ruin you, she hissed, cheeks burning with shame. The bridesmaids froze, their bouquets trembled in their hands. Even Marin's closest friends, those who'd smiled at her side during champagne toasts and gown fittings, looked away with eyes downcast. One of them whispered, incredulous, she actually said that? Their voices drifted through the room like frightened birds. Kian stepped forward, his tall frame blocking her father's view of me. He placed his hand gently on my shoulder. The simple weight of his palm steadied me, reminded me who I was here for. His voice was calm but carried a steel edge. This man, he said, nodding toward me, raised me. Sacrificed everything he had to give me a future you could never imagine. His words struck the walls, echoing with unwavering conviction. I felt every head turn to me, breaths held in collective anticipation. I took a slow step forward, finding a measure of composure in Kian's unwavering gaze. The dust on my boots, the sweat stains on my shirt, even the trembling of my hands, all of it belonged to a story of love and sacrifice. My voice came steady, surprisingly clear. You don't have to like me, I said, meeting Marin's father and mother with eyes unflinching, but you will respect me, because I didn't raise a fool, and he just proved it today. A hush descended so deep I could hear the soft hum of the air conditioner. Marin's father opened his mouth, closed it, then looked at his daughter as if seeing her for the first time. Marin's cheeks had lost their color, tears glittered at the edge of her lashes. She yelled once more, an unsteady bark of protest, then her voice wavered and broke into sorrowful sobs. But no one seized her hand, no one offered comfort. The same people who once draped her in compliments now recoiled as if her words had poisoned the air. I stood there, chest tight, as Marin's mother sank lower into her chair, head in her hands. The bridesmaids shuffled away toward the lobby, the clicking of their heels carrying them from her world into indifference. Her friends exchanged embarrassed glances, then drifted out, leaving her alone with her collapse. Kian drew me aside into the hall's quiet corridor. His arm found mine in solidarity, and I rested my head on his shoulder for a moment. "We're done here," he whispered. I nodded, feeling the burden lift as we turned to leave. Behind us, Marin's wails faded into the hush of an empty ceremony. Outside, the city's pulse resumed. Hawkers calling, traffic humming, life unfurling in the warmth of afternoon sun. As we stepped into that brightness, I realized the wedding may have collapsed, but something stronger had taken its place, our bond, solid and unshakable, forged in sacrifice and love. And no amount of scorn or splintered expectations could undo the truth of where I belonged, by my brother's side, always. After we walked away from the hall, the evening air felt like a balm, warm with the distant hum of Lagos nightlife. Kian and I ducked into our favorite suya stand, the charcoal smoke curling around us as sticks of spicy meat hissed on the grill. We settled onto the low stools, ordered 2 skewers and malt drinks, and let the world spin around us while we leaned into familiarity. He laughed, deep, relieved. And I realized it was the first time I'd seen him truly exhale in weeks. Over skewers, we recounted the day's madness, the empty chairs, Marin's storm of fury, her family's collapse, and our defiant exit. Each memory felt surreal, like scenes from someone else's life. But I felt pride and exhaustion settle together in my chest. I had risked humiliation, walked into an arena where I wasn't welcome, and stood steadfast beside him. In his eyes, I saw gratitude that needed no words. A month later, I sat in a cramped classroom at the Adult Education Center, the chalk-dusted air reminding me of the school I'd abandoned so long ago. I balanced a pencil on my knee. I was tracing the letters on the whiteboard, algebra basics. Around me, fellow students ranged from teenagers catching up to mid-career professionals pursuing promotions. My palms itched for the feel of chalk, but I nodded along as the instructor explained equations. This time, I was the one who would earn the diploma, not just help someone else. Across town, Kian was thriving at university. He called me every evening, describing lectures on pharmacology and biology, his voice bright with excitement. He'd won a prestigious scholarship to study abroad next year, an opportunity he credited to the sacrifice I made. Each call ended with him promising to send reminders for my study schedule and offering to quiz me on algebra. Our roles had come full circle. Now I was the brother in need of guidance, and he was the guardian of knowledge. Work at the construction site shifted, too. My reputation for dedication had spread, and my foreman offered me a new position in safety inspection. I completed the necessary certification within weeks, leaning on late-night study sessions fueled by determination. The salary increase felt like vindication, a concrete reward for every gritty hour under Lagos sun. Then, one afternoon, I met someone new. She was waiting at the market stall I passed on my way home, a fellow student from the evening classes. Her smile was tentative, curious, unguarded in a way I hadn't seen in Marin's polished facade. We struck up a conversation about exam prep, then shared a plate of puff-puff and palm wine under the market awning. She asked about my story, how a construction worker ended up in an adult classroom, and I found myself speaking freely, without shame. She listened, eyes warm with empathy, and I felt the tension in my chest ease. Next week, I'll introduce her to Kian. I'll drive him to meet her at that same suya stand where we reclaimed our bond. And this time, I'll carry the framed portraits of our parents in the passenger seat, proud of where we came from and excited for what lies ahead. Because rebuilding from the rubble isn't just about brick and mortar. It's about forging new paths, strengthening family, and opening our hearts to futures we once thought impossible.